Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video, and today I'm sharing my wrap-up for all the books that I finished in May as I set up my reading journal for the month. I finished 8 books in May, from 2 stars all the way up to 5 stars, so I have lots of things to share. I know I missed my April wrap-up, I apologize. I did end up doing a live stream with my patrons to set up some of my April spreads and share my thoughts on the books I finished in April. So if you are a patron in one of the top 2 tiers and you missed that stream, you can always go back and watch it. If you're not a patron, there are other ways to know what I thought of the books I finished in April. I do have a bit of an overview wrap-up on my Instagram, on my feed, and of course, there's Goodreads. You can add me as a friend on Goodreads with the link in the description box. Sometimes I'm a bit slow to add some of my reviews, but I generally try to stay on top of them, so you can always go there to see my thoughts. Starting with the cover page here, and I really wanted to go with an art-inspired, summertime, light and airy vibe. So I picked out some images of light pastel-colored paintings and a painting of a palette with paint on it, which is a little bit meta, and I like it. I usually go with more desaturated, darker, warmer tones for my cover pages, but I do sometimes step out into something different in the summertime to get a bit of a lighter, airier vibe, and I'm really happy with how these images came together for this cover page. It definitely feels super summery. As always, I link a bunch of the supplies I'm using in the description box. If I missed something, let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to add it. As always, I love to start with a little bit of tea-stained paper. If you want to try tea-staining paper but you've never tried it before, I do have a tutorial on my channel. It'll be linked in the description box if you want to follow along. I actually follow along my own tutorial every time I have to make another batch because it's usually months and months and months between when I need to do it again because I do huge batches at a time, and in between I often forget how to do it. So I'm glad I made a tutorial because I watch it myself. After the tea-stained paper, I'll add in the main images that I'm using, and then after that, it's time to add all the little extra details to tie things together. Washi tape, stamps, little doodles, just a process of layering and adding more textures and using different mediums until I feel like it's done, which is sometimes hard to gauge. I will admit, sometimes I can't tell if I need a little bit more or if I've already done a bit too much. Finding the perfect spot to stop can be a bit of a challenge, but I feel like that's what makes doing a more scrapbooky style spread interesting. Now flipping over to my overview spreads. So these are the spreads for all the book covers for the books that I finished in May on one side, and then all my reading stats on the right. It seems like y'all would really like to see a video talking about a bit of the behind the scenes of what I do for my reading journal, how I find images I use, how I resize book covers, how I make my stats in Canva. So I have taken that on board and I'm hoping to be able to make that video at some point soon. I just need to figure out where it slots into my schedule. So like I mentioned, I finished 8 books in May. So I'm going to glue down the covers on this spread, and I generally like to loosely order the covers in a bit of a rainbow order in a gradient instead of chronological order of when I finished them, just because it's a little bit more visually pleasing for my eyeballs. I really like having these spreads. It's a nice quick way to be able to flip through a reading journal and see at a glance what books I read in each month. If I'm looking for a specific book, that can be a faster way to find it. And it also just gives me an impression month to month, how many books I read, what they were, and what my ratings were like. I also love doing the stats, even though they take quite a while to put together and also to cut out and glue into my reading journal. As I've mentioned before, I use Canva to make the actual graphs and charts, and showing the process of how I track my stats in a spreadsheet, how I transfer them over to Canva and make the graphs and charts, and how I print them out and put them in my reading journal. All of that will be part of that sort of behind the scenes process video that y'all have requested. So I'll give you a quick overview of my stats for May. As far as the racial identity of the authors I read from in May, I didn't do nearly as good of a job as I usually do reading diversely in this area. 87.5% of the authors I read from were white and 12.5% were Black. As for some other rep that I like to track in the books I read, including neurodiversity, mental illness, and disability rep, 77.8% of the books I read had none of that rep, 11.1% had neurodiversity rep, and 11.1% had disability rep. Moving on to my ratings in May, I had 0 1-star reads, 2 2-star reads, 0 3-star reads, 2 4-star reads, and 4 5-star reads, which is kind of awesome. As for the author's nationality, 5 of them were American, 1 was Australian, and 2 were British. Looking at author's gender identity, I had 87.5% women and 12.5% men. Moving on to where I got the books I read in May, I have a tie for the biggest chunk of this pie, 37.5% for owned physically and also from Scribd. The physical books thing makes sense since I did do my physical TBR reading challenge in May. If you missed that reading vlog, check it out. I thought it was lots of fun. I'll have it linked for you. And then I have another tie for 12.5% for ARCs and the library. As for the genre of the books I read in May, 3 out of the 8 were fantasy, 2 were horror, 1 was contemporary, 1 was literary fiction, and 1 was nonfiction. Looking at the types of books that I read in May, 50% were novels, 25% were novellas, 12.5% was the nonfiction I read, and 12.5% for the short story collection. Looking at the LGBTQIA plus rep in the books I read in May, 50% had LGBTQIA plus rep and the other 50% did not. Looking at the years published for the books I read in May, 2 were published this year, 2023, 3 were published in 2022, none in 2021, 2 in 2020, and then 1 book all the way back in 1979. Looking at the age demographic of the books I read this month, 75% were aimed at adults and 25% were aimed at young adults. 100% of the books I read in May were written in English and also read in English, no translated works or works read in my second language. And the last stat I'm including this month is the format. 37.5% I read in physical form, 37.5% I listened to the audiobook, 12.5% were mixed media, so I read the physical book or the ebook while listening to the audiobook simultaneously, and 12.5% I read the ebook. So those are my May stats for all my fellow stat nerds out there. I always find it really interesting to see how my reading plays out at the end of the month. Now it's time to get into the spreads dedicated to the books I read in May, my actual book entries. As always, I like to start with a full page entry for our book club pick for the month. I do have a book club with my patrons. That's the top tier on Patreon, which you can join if you're interested. There's a link in the description box, always. In May, our book club pick was Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which is an awesome name, by the way. And I really, really enjoyed it. I found it incredibly fascinating. I also was very surprised by Merlin Sheldrake's writing style. It was much more poetic and philosophical and lyrical than I had expected going into a book all about fungi. I also found it really inspiring because I happen to be in the midst of writing a sci-fi novel that features fungi and mycelium pretty heavily. It was the first project I did with NaNoWriMo a couple years ago, and I haven't touched it since I hit my goal on the final day of NaNoWriMo 2 NaNoWriMos ago. But as I was reading this book, I was getting super inspired. I had one note on my phone for all the things that I was taking down to use for reference to write my future review and also for book club questions. But then I also had a second note going simultaneously that was all the ideas I was getting for my book. So now I'm thinking I might want to do NaNoWriMo this year to try to finish that book with all these new ideas. Although November is close to, if not the worst possible month for me to do something like NaNoWriMo, and both times I've done it, I've wondered why I was doing it to myself. I'm not sure it's great for my mental health, but it is really interesting and fun and fulfilling, even though it's always a lot. So who knows? Anyway, it's really fascinating. He talks about fungi from really, really early on, ancient times, and interactions between fungi and plants, fungi and humans, fungi and non-human animals, fungi and insects, all of the ways that fungi and mycelium are really crucial to a lot of ecosystems and, the lives of individual organisms, and even just evolution in general on our planet. Our planet would not look the way it does. We wouldn't have plants on land, potentially, without the interaction between fungi and plants. I learned so many interesting facts that blew my mind, and it was really cool to hear a bit about where the science is right now and what questions mycologists are asking, what they're trying to prove, what they're trying to discover. It feels like we're on the cusp of some really exciting discoveries, not only with fungi in general, the nature of what fungi really is, how it works, whether it has an intelligence of its own, and also all of the seemingly unlimited uses for fungi and mycelium for technological advancement and helping to counteract climate change. So it feels like a really exciting time for mycologists, and it's cool to peek in to that world and see all of the excitement and everything that's being done, everything that's being studied and learned about. And I really enjoyed that Sheldrake asked more questions than he answered for the most part. He really was taking a step back and questioning his own biases and impressions and preconceived notions about fungi, and constantly questioning whether he was being open to seeing what's in front of him instead of imposing his own views onto what he was observing. I found it really refreshing for a nonfiction book about science to be so focused on curiosity and asking questions over having all the answers, because I think that's what bothers me the most about a lot of science books that I've read in my life, is that they are too focused on giving sure, simple, perfectly packaged answers, when reality is very seldom so simple and easy to wrap up with a tidy bow. So I felt like I was very aligned with Sheldrake in terms of my worldviews, I guess, or my view on science and how it should be approached. So I really enjoyed it for that as well. And he referenced some of my favorite sciencey people throughout the book, like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, which was my favorite book that I read last year, and Paul Stamets, who is a super cool guy in the world of fungi. Overall, I had a great time. I would highly recommend it if you have any interest in nature nonfiction, or if you're into fungi. Definitely a must read. And also I recommend you check out Merlin Sheldrake's YouTube channel, because he is a quirky guy. and he has some really interesting videos. The picture that I included here of the book with mushrooms growing out of it is a real picture of a copy of his book that he grew mushrooms out of, and then he ate the mushrooms in a video. Very strange, but I like strange. Moving on to the spreads for the books I read in my physical TBR video, starting with The Collected Regrets of Clover by Mikki Brammer. I'm not going to go too in depth on these 3 books because I do have an entire reading vlog where I went much more in depth. So you can check out that video if you want more of my thoughts on these 3 and also just immediate thoughts upon finishing. But to be very brief, I loved The Collected Regrets of Clover. It is a book about Clover, who is a death doula, and even though she is constantly facing death with her clients, she has been unable to fully accept and process the grief and guilt over the death of her grandfather while she was traveling abroad. And this book is a really beautiful journey of her slowly starting to learn to let herself begin the process of grieving. It's also a book that explores a lot of larger conversations around grief and why we're so scared of allowing ourselves to grieve, why we're so scared of talking about death, even though it's an inevitability. It is just a part of life. We can't escape it, but we're very scared to face it and to talk about it. I thought the book was really beautiful. The characters were awesome. I said I was going to be brief and I'm not being brief. Anyway, I highly recommend it. It was very good. And that's all I'll say. If you want to see me cry as I finish the book, that is in the reading vlog. Then the other 2 books I read in that video, Luster by Raven Leilani and The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. Luster, again, I'll try to be brief, but like I said in my reading vlog video when I was wrapping everything up, it's oddly similar to The Collected Regrets of Clover in some ways, in that it is in large part a character study of a very lonely woman who is processing a lot of difficult, big feelings and, maybe stuck in a bit of a place of not being able to move forward. And over the course of the book, being allowed to take a step forward and to start that transformative process into the next iteration of themselves. But other than that, they are quite different books. Luster is about Edie, who is a Black woman in her 20s, and she's a painter or a former painter. She hasn't painted for a few years. She's working in publishing, and she wants to get back into painting, but she just can't find that inspiration. She feels so disconnected from it. And she's really in this stuck place, and she's seeking refuge in not necessarily the most healthy sexual relationships. And she gets into this complicated situation where she starts dating a man who's married, and he and his wife have decided to try an open relationship, and this is the first person that he's dating, and she ends up living in their house, and it's a whole thing. It's a very strange book, but it was also really beautifully written, very dark and funny, sort of on that razor's edge between incredibly uncomfortable and upsetting and depressing and really funny and tongue-in-cheek and almost silly at times. And I thought it was really well balanced. I loved how much of the book was about the experience of being an artist who has artist's block and is struggling to find that connection with creativity again. Very relatable as someone who has made a living off of artistic pursuits for my entire adult life. I really, really enjoyed it. And then the final book from that physical TBR video, which was The Bloody Chamber. This is a short story collection. This is the one from 1979. And basically it's a feminist retelling of a series of folktales and fairy tales. So reimaginings of The Tale of Bluebeard or Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast, Puss in Boots, etc. As with most short story collections, there were some stories that resonated with me much more than others. So I ended up giving it 4 stars, even though some of the stories were incredibly fantastic. There were just a couple that I really didn't love, so I didn't feel comfortable giving it a full 5 stars. If you want to hear more of my in-depth thoughts and hear my ratings for each story individually, you can check out my reading vlog or You can look on Goodreads. I have all my individual ratings on there as well. My favorite stories in the collection were The Bloody Chamber and The Earl King. Those two were incredible, fantastic. And then in third place, not quite a 5-star story for me, but still very good, was The Lady of the House of Love. I loved the darker feminist take on these stories. I really enjoyed Angela Carter's writing. It was so sumptuous and exquisite and vividly descriptive. Just a treat. An absolute pleasure to read. Moving on to the final spread of this setup, these are the last 4 books I read in the month that weren't part of any particular reading challenge or anything. They were just the other books I picked up. And as per usual, I kind of like to scale my book entries based on how much I liked them. So my 2 2-star reads are getting a quarter page each. Hyde was a 4-star read, which normally I would give a full page, but I really wanted to fit all of these on a single spread, so I'm giving it a half page. And then Lost in the Moment and Found, which is my last 5-star read for May, is getting a full page. Where the Drowned Girls Go and Lost in the Moment and Found are both books in the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. These are a series of young adult novellas. They're fantasy, and they follow children who are, for whatever reason, feeling unsafe or unaccepted or out of place in their lives, in their homes, and they come across a door that asks them to be sure, and when they enter the door, they enter some sort of fantasy world that is suited to them in one way or another, and some of them are bubbly and happy and bright, and some of them are dark and scary and dangerous. A really fun series, really heartwarming. I don't love every single installment, but I generally really enjoy them, which is why I keep going with the series. These were books 7 and 8 in the series, if I'm not mistaken. So Where the Drowned Girls Go is the 7th installment, and it wasn't my favorite. I gave it 2 stars. This is a book that doesn't involve going through a door at all. It completely takes place in the regular world at a rival school to the one that we've come to know through the series, and it just didn't super work for me. I didn't love the plot. I didn't feel it was all that fleshed out. I liked the characters well enough, but they just didn't have a lot to do. It was very meh for me. Lute was my other 2-star read for May, and this is an adult horror where we're on this little island that is idyllic. Everyone's happy. People seem to be protected. Except every 7 years, there's a day where a bunch of people die and there's no way around it. And our protagonist is experiencing her first of these days where she's actually going to be on the island with her 2 young children and her spouse who grew up on the island. And she really doesn't get all the hype. She doesn't understand what the deal is with this day because she's never experienced it. And apparently she's never cared enough to properly ask anyone about it, which was one of the things that bothered me the most about this book. And we go through the day as people die in a variety of ways, and we follow our protagonist wondering if she's going to be one of the ones to go, and it just really didn't work for me. I really disliked the protagonist. I found her very annoying. She was so comfortable in her ignorance and just didn't care to learn anything about the significance of the day and just continued to spew really strange comments about it, just willfully ignorant of the whole thing. It was strange. And then there was a romance shoehorned in that was really uncomfy. It involved infidelity. Our main character was married, but she had a romance with another man over the course of the day, and it was weird. It didn't need to happen. It felt very strange that the romance was in there at all. And the ending was supposed to be a happy ending, I think, but it was really weird to me. I felt icky about it, so not the best book for me. I did give it 2 stars because I thought the concept was really cool, and I thought the tension and atmosphere was pretty well done, but other than that, it was not for me. Moving on to Hyde, which was my other horror read for the month. This was a 4-star read for me. This one is about 14 young adults who are given the opportunity of a lifetime to play hide and seek, essentially, for 7 days in an abandoned amusement park for the chance to win $50,000. And we follow our protagonist, Mac, who is homeless after experiencing a really incredibly traumatizing, horrific event in her childhood. She needs this $50K to get a place where she can live and stay inside and keep to herself and stay safe. She's very traumatized. I loved her as a character. I found her really interesting. I appreciated that the author wrote two different visions of what post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma in general can look like in both Mac and her love interest, Ava, who has PTSD from being in the military. I thought the atmosphere was super creepy. I thought the bad guy, the villain of the book, was really scary. The characters I thought were really well drawn. You know, the relationships, both platonic and romantic, I thought were really well developed and realistic for the situation where, yes, it's been a short period of time, but they're in such a traumatic, harrowing situation that everything is amplified and sped up. The other characters were interesting too, though we didn't get quite as much time with them, just based on the premise of the book. People start dying off pretty quick. People seem to either love it or hate it. I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. It's not going to be for everyone, but I enjoyed the sapphic rep. I thought the larger social commentary was well done. It was quite subtle, but still effective, I thought, and covered quite a few topics from homophobia and sexism and classism to generational animosity between boomers and millennials or Gen Z, misuse of resources and exploitation. I thought it was great. Definitely not a perfect book. My biggest pet peeve was naming two characters Ava for no reason. The gimmick got old really fast as the author tried to find new fun ways to differentiate between them, calling them Ava 1 or 2 or Ava and the other Ava. I was annoyed with it after the first page that they were introduced. It just didn't need to happen. But anyway, I thought it was a great, quick horror read. I'd recommend it if you're into that kind of thing. And the last book I read in May, Lost in the Moment and Found. This is the 8th installment in the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. This is possibly my favorite installment of the entire series. We follow Antsy, our main character, who is in a really, really bad situation at home. Her mother has remarried after the death of her father, and her stepfather is a predator, and she escapes. She runs away from home, she finds her door, and she enters it into this strange shop for lost things out of time, where her only company is an old woman and a talking crow. From this shop, she's able to access a bunch of other doors that go into fantastical lands. There's a mystery there that has to be unraveled. I thought it was really beautifully done. I cared so much for Antsy. This is a very personal story for Seanan McGuire, and I really appreciated that she included trigger warnings at the beginning for a story like this that has this kind of content. I think that's so vital. I felt that the topic was explored with so much respect, and it was incredibly heartbreaking just reading about any child who is made to feel unsafe in their home, in the very place where they should be the safest, feeling like they can't tell anyone what they're going through, that they are not protected, that they are not safe, just on a basic level with the people whose job it should be to keep them safe. That's such a core betrayal. It's just absolutely heartbreaking that any child should ever have to suffer that, and so many children do. So I got very emotional reading this book. I cared so much about Antsy. I felt really hopeful at the end of this book, but I really hope she comes back in a later installment because I want to see her full, proper, happy ending because she really deserves it. A really heart-wrenching, you feel your stomach drop to your toes reading this, and yet it was really beautiful. Really beautifully handled. So I really loved this. It's definitely heavy and intense, but I think it was my favorite book of this series. And I think it really highlights why I keep reading this series, even when there are installments that don't stick with me quite as much, because at its core, this is really a series for kids who have felt this way, who have felt unsafe and unloved and like they don't fit in, whether it's because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation or their body or their interests or their neurodiversity or mental illness, or because they've been victimized by someone else, they're being singled out and abused, whatever it is that these children are given the opportunity to escape to a place where they do belong, where they do fit, and find kindred spirits who understand what it's like to feel adrift and to be safe and loved and cared for and important and special. And I think this series could mean a lot to kids who are having those experiences in real life, to read about other kids who are going through similar things and are finding a place where they belong and finding hope. I think that's really beautiful, and I think it's important. So, yeah. So that brings me to the end of my May wrap up. I'll do a flip through of all the spreads so you can see how they turned out. But I hope you enjoyed this. Give this video a like if you did, subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments down below how many books you read in May. Feel free to share your favorite of the month if you want, your least favorite, little mini reviews about all the books you read if you want. I would love to hear what you're reading and what you're loving and what you're not. It's always super interesting. I have another reading vlog coming up next week. That's the plan anyway, and it should be an interesting one, so hopefully you're looking forward to it. Turn on the bell if you want to be notified when I post another video. Without further ado, I'm going to wrap this one up. Thank you as always to my patrons for your support. I appreciate you all to the moon and back. If you made it all the way to the end because you're a real one, leave a bookish emoji in the comments so I can see you and give you my thanks. And with that, I'm going to get going. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.